Before reincarnation, capital typically goes through a familiar cycle. But what is the underlying logic behind this cycle? Through the first three parts, we learned that in the beginning, people exchanged goods directly, bartering one item for another, the most primitive form of economy. Later, money emerged as a medium of exchange, making trade more convenient and eliminating the need for the double coincidence of wants between both parties. Eventually, under capitalist manipulation, the relationship between goods and money changed. Money started chasing commodities, and commodities were converted into more money. In this cycle, a crucial turning point occurred. Wealth no longer just circulated in the market. It began to concentrate, forming the process of capital accumulation. But what exactly is this turning point? How did it change the economic and social logic of the time? And why did it silently create a vicious cycle? This is what we explore in Part 4 of Capital, which also serves as the final chapter of Volume 1. If we dissect the exploitative process of primitive accumulation, we'll realize that before capitalism achieved real accumulation, there was an earlier stage called preliminary accumulation, as named by Adam Smith. Think of this stage as a starting point, not the end result of the capitalist mode of production, but rather the beginning of forceful appropriation and domination. This is also when the shift from static to dynamic capital began. Even under static conditions, capital could complete cycles, and this continuity provided the logical foundation for dynamic capitalist accumulation later on. This is the core idea behind Marx's theory of simple reproduction. This part may feel abstract or complex, so let's simplify using earlier concepts. Capitalists extract surplus labor from workers. Workers use their wages to purchase consumer goods. This consumption creates the market for capitalists to sell their products. Capitalists then reinvest the profits into a new production cycle. Thus, the reproduction loop is formed. Production continues without necessarily increasing the initial investment. Now, when we combine all this and trace how surplus value moves, we can better understand Marx's concepts. When money is turned into means of production and labor, that is the first stage of capital's function, happening in the market. Next comes the production process, where these inputs become new commodities. Since these commodities hold more value than their components, they must be sold. Value is converted back into money, which is then reinvested as capital. This never-ending repetition, money, goods, production, goods, money, capital, creates the circulation of capital. But this system has a hidden requirement. The capitalist must be able to sell the product and reinvest most of the proceeds as new capital. Only then can accumulation continue. As long as accumulation occurs, the capitalist keeps selling products, converting proceeds into capital, and restarting the cycle. However, even though the capitalist is the first appropriator of surplus value, they are not its final owner. They must share the surplus with other types of capitalists in the system, such as landowners, financiers, and more. In plain terms, after stealing the value created by workers, capitalists must split the loot with others in different roles, ensuring the system keeps spinning. Once we understand the nature of surplus value, it becomes clear that surplus value is not singular in form. In fact, it is divided into various parts: profit, interest, taxes, rent, etc. These parts are owned by different individuals and manifest in distinct independent forms. These transformations are the central subject of Volume 3 of Capital. For now, it's essential to grasp this foundational idea before exploring the deeper mechanics. Now that you understand simple reproduction, you can also begin to grasp a core philosophical concept: the inherent contradiction of capital. The heart of this contradiction lies in the fact that workers' wages are just enough to sustain their minimum subsistence. Yet their labor produces value that far exceeds their own cost. The surplus created by this labor does not belong to the worker. It is seized and exploited freely by the capitalist. This contradiction is the very foundation of capitalist exploitation. At the same time, it gives us the lens to recognize ideological manipulation. No matter how capitalism tries to justify itself, it cannot hide the objective truth of its exploitation. This distorted, relentless mode of production helps normalize capitalism's class structure. Capitalists brainwash workers using twisted logic to justify their actions. In modern terms, this is akin to PUA, emotional manipulation. Capitalists insist that the relationship between them and workers is one of free contractual labor, not exploitation. They describe their extraction of labor as reasonable and eternal. stabilizing the surface while hiding deep internal contradictions. But once you develop the ability to see through it, you'll recognize the process for what it is, a self-negating mechanism within capitalism itself. The accumulation of capital intensifies its internal contradictions, eventually impacting the entire structure of society. You might ask, do capitalists know this? Yes, and not only do they know, they intentionally manufacture such opposition. Why? Because for money to become capital, production and exchange are not enough. There must be an opposing polarity. One side owns money and means of production. The other owns nothing but labor power. This separation between labor and its product, between material conditions and human agency, forms the basis and starting point of capitalism. If this still feels abstract, ask yourself, do those who win the race ever really help those still running? Initially, capital was just a starting point. But through the constant repetition of simple reproduction, it becomes a permanent engine of value creation, always reinforcing itself. Material wealth is constantly turned into a tool for further capital accumulation by capitalists. Workers, on the other hand, are trapped in a vicious cycle. They enter the production process and leave it in the same state. Though they create wealth, they are stripped of the right and means to access it. Even before they begin, their labor has already been alienated, absorbed into the capitalist machine. During production, their labor is objectified, turned into products for others to own. Their effort becomes commodities, then capital, used to generate more value. Even worse, the wealth they produce is used to buy the necessities that barely sustain them, and even tools to control them. To put it plainly, once a worker steps into this cycle, the capitalist begins to feed off their labor like a leech. Capital swells, workers wither, and over, the worker transforms their labor into a force that opposes them, exploits them, and dominates them. Yet they remain powerless. The capitalist comes to view labor as an abstract input, detached from humanity. The worker is no longer a human being, but a production tool without blood, soul, or emotion. Those who have dreams in the wheels of capitalism often find themselves trapped in a repetitive cycle. The process of capital accumulation continues endlessly, gradually fixing workers into the role of wage laborers, causing their lives to revolve not around their own dreams, but around the needs of capital. Even when someone talks about ideals or emotions, others may mock them, condemning their quest for self-discovery as naive or useless. Eventually, this breeds a form of self-imposed enslavement. People create wealth with their own hands, only to have it seized by capitalists, and that wealth becomes the very chain that binds them. And this is only the beginning of capitalist accumulation. Initially, it's a static process, but when surplus value is reinvested into production to expand scale, the process becomes dynamic, complex, and far more ruthless. This is what Marx calls the general law of capitalist accumulation. The outcome? Concentration of wealth intensifies, and relative poverty spreads. Capital gains absolute control over labor. A quick aside, why do philosophy students use abstract jargon? It's not to show off. For example, forms of surplus value transformation is our main theme here. But we needed an entire section earlier to explain what surplus value is. Once understood, it becomes a shortcut, saving time and allowing us to go deeper without repeating. Back to the point. Some may ask, since capitalists can already exploit workers indefinitely, why reinvest surplus value, buy more production materials, and hire more workers? Isn't that risky? What if a cautious, risk-averse capitalist decides not to reinvest? Wouldn't that disprove Marx's law? The answer lies in cutthroat competition. There are big and small capitalists, but all of them compete on the backs of laborers suffering. That's why wealth becomes more concentrated, as large capital merges with, acquires, or wipes out smaller ones. Thus, means of production become monopolized by a few elite capitalists, while workers' conditions steadily decline. To put it plainly, capitalists compete outwardly, while workers are forced to compete inwardly, leading to worsening inequality. Let's push this further. When the market becomes saturated, more goods than actual demand, prices crash. What then? Capitalists export their surplus, or shift the crisis onto other nations. What if other nations refuse? That's when wars of aggression begin. As Machiavelli wrote in The Prince, victors have three ways to treat defeated but formerly free nations: destroy them, occupy them militarily, or set up puppet governments to maintain control while draining resources. This explains why many modern countries are only nominally independent. In truth, they're semi-colonies, ruled by local oligarchs propped up by foreign economic and military powers. These oligarchs exploit their own people to feed global capital. Returning to the core issue, as capital accumulates, relative poverty increases. With advancements in technology and productivity, capitalists shorten necessary labor time and extend surplus labor, thereby increasing the rate of exploitation. The result? Capitalists accumulate wealth at accelerated rates, while workers' incomes stagnate or grow very slowly. This causes widening inequality across society. Thus, Marx summarized this law as follows. One extreme of capital accumulation is the concentration of wealth, while the other is poverty, oppression, and the enslavement of labor. If this oppression were to be visualized, it would first be reflected in the intentional creation of unemployment. The more capital is accumulated, the greater the portion of the population excluded from production. As discussed in Part 3, after the Industrial Revolution, when British capitalists introduced machinery, the demand for living labor declined, resulting in many workers being pushed out and forming an industrial reserve army. This unemployed class became a tool for capitalists to suppress wages and sustain the imbalance in the labor market. It was not only a method for keeping wages low, but also a major source of the increasing poverty among workers. Meanwhile, although capital's goal is always to expand production or capture more market share, the concentration of capital and the impoverishment of labor lead to a drop in collective purchasing power. As a result, economic stagnation and even severe deflation emerge, eventually culminating in explosive contradictions. This reveals that the development of capitalism is not, as bourgeois economists argue, the product of natural trade or frugal accumulation, but rather the result of a historical process of violence. Marx referred to this as primitive accumulation, a phase in which capital, through violent and institutional means, separated workers from the means of production, enabling large-scale coercive exploitation. One of the clearest examples was the enclosure movement in 16th-century England, when nobles and capitalists appropriated feudal land from peasants, transforming it into private property for capitalist production. Countless farmers lost their land, flooded into the cities, or became slaves to machines. This act of land seizure led to even more wealth being concentrated in the hands of a few. Likewise, colonialism served as a violent tool for capital accumulation. Through wars, the slave trade, the looting of gold and silver from the Americas and Africa, and the creation of plantation economies. The exploitation of gold mines in Latin America and the use of slave labor brought vast wealth to European capitalist nations and laid the foundation for a global capitalist system rooted in violence. Institutional forces also supported accumulation. Monarchs and aristocrats used taxation, debt, and military power to finance early capitalist production. In France and the Netherlands, heavy taxes were levied to fund capitalist enterprises. As Marx noted in the final chapter of Volume 1, colonialism was not only the origin of capitalism, but also its ongoing mechanism of global expansion. Through colonization, capitalist production relations were forcibly imposed on non-capitalist societies. Capitalists extracted resources, labor, and markets from colonies to accumulate wealth on a global scale. This explains why so many historical dramas and documentaries revolve around African gold, ivory, and rubber, American sugar, cotton, and tobacco, and the slave trade. All of these point to the same brutal truth. Colonies were forced or manipulated into providing cheap labor and becoming consumer markets to minimize costs for capitalists. Take India under British rule, for instance. Artisans and farmers were forbidden to produce for local needs, and instead forced to serve British capitalist interests. This model destroyed local economies and supplied vast surplus value to the empire. Millions starved, their bones bleaching the plains. Colonies were turned into captive markets through military conquest and unequal treaties. British goods flooded India, while its local textile industry was crushed. Looking at the broader picture, capitalist nations became global centers of accumulation, while the colonies were pushed to the margins as sources of cheap resources and labor. Colonialism allowed capitalist core countries to export internal crises. When domestic markets became saturated, colonies became the dumping ground for surplus and crises. At this point, the situation is no longer a matter of simple economic exploitation. It has evolved into a form of racial oppression. All moral boundaries, all traces of humanity have been cast aside, What remains is violence driven solely by the pursuit of surplus value, racism, mass killings, and insatiable greed among those who have lost all sense of right and wrong. Ironically, the capitalists, the very ones responsible for all this, never admit to their exploitation. Instead, they repeatedly declare that it's all just a matter of free choice in the market. Once we understand this, we gain a new level of awareness. Just now, we expanded our vision and looked at history with a wider lens, to truly see the limitations and destructiveness of capitalism by applying the perspective of historical materialism. At this moment, I firmly believe that those of you sitting in front of the screen will deeply grasp how vicious the enemies our ancestors once faced truly were, and how brutal the ideologies they struggled against were. We now better understand how difficult and hard-won the victories of the working class were, and we also come to recognize that the greatness of our predecessors is no longer just slogans. It becomes something we can feel and witness. A nation can only have true hope when it still has people who look up at the stars. And our forebears, those who once looked to the sky with hope, are the ones who fought tirelessly to win us a future. I believe that the true meaning of inheritance is this, that those of you watching today will learn from them, become them, and ultimately surpass them. There may be those who criticize or attack us, and to them I say, you may choose not to be someone who contributes to society, but you have no right to mock, insult, or drag down those who are still striving to move forward. Do not judge a dynamic process by its static appearance. History always reveals one common truth. True greatness has always revolved around the people, and it is the people who are the creators of world history.